Today it's my pleasure to chat with Satchin Panda. He's a friend of mine and a professor at the Salk Institute. His expertise is in circadian rhythms and health and metabolism. And he's well known for his recent work on time-restricted eating, limiting the time window each day people eat to a confined period and how that can affect circadian rhythms and health and risk for disease. And we'll talk about that quite a bit a little later on. So Satchin, why don't you give our viewers and listeners a background on you? You grew up in India. Did either of your parents, were they interested in science or medicine?
Well, in those days, yeah. So I grew up in India, and my father worked for the state agriculture department. So he was, I think, he was responsible for recommending crop species and how to control pests and etc. for a given county or something. And then my mother was a middle school teacher, and she taught in India at that time. When you're a middle school teacher, you got to cover quite a few subjects, literature to science and math, everything in between. So yeah, so I grew up in
your initial interest in agriculture was either directly or through osmosis came from your father.
Actually, that's a different route to it, because actually I was interested in, just like in India, every kid, when they grow up, their parents want them to go to med school or engineering school. And I was also interested in one of those. But then it's kind of a long story, because during my high school, I lost my junior high, I lost my father. And then I figured out that the fastest way to get a job so that I could support the family was to go to an Aggie school, because if you finish Aggie school in India, then in those days you could get a job right away in the agriculture department. Or since the Indian economy was at that time still heavily agricultural, 60% plus GDP was from agriculture. There are also a lot of jobs in the banking sector with people graduating from Aggie school. So that was my initial foray into Aggie school. But in agriculture, during agriculture, I got more and more interested in plant breeding and genetics, and that's how I developed my interest in molecular biology, genetics, that kind of area.
And did you do some research projects then in India before you moved to the United States?
I actually did a master's degree in India, and as part of my master's thesis, I studied how symbiotic organisms fix nitrogen, and it was kind of interesting to study that, because what was obvious is nitrogen fixation then occurs in a very reductive environment. So whereas the cells usually have some kind of nutrient oxidation, so how these reductive and oxidative processes occur at in the same cell, that was kind of a big question at that time. And then I worked in a flavor and fragrance company, international flavor and fragrance, trying to understand the curing process of vanilla, how vanilla beans produce their flavor after 3 to 4 years of curing, what biochemical changes happen during this process, and what can we do to accelerate that process. So all of this kind of increased my curiosity in science, but at the same time, I was actually more interested in circadian rhythm in general, but specifically the biology of time, because we mostly, even till now, biomedical research is entirely focused on what a gene does, but not about when that gene does the process. But if you look at most of the human diseases, they're linked to some alteration in timing. For example, Normal cells divide and cancer cells divide. The difference is how quickly the cancer cells divide. Similarly, our glucose goes up after eating, and it has to come down with 45 to 90 minutes to baseline. And when that decline takes a long time, that's when we get diabetes.
Yeah.
Similarly, neurons fire at certain frequency, and when that firing frequency changes,
Yeah.
then that leads to disease. So I was broadly interested in how timing
Yeah.
encodes health or mistiming encodes disease.
Yeah.
And at that time, when I was looking at timing, there is this universal 24 hours timing that's encoded in every organism from pond scum to humans.
Yeah.
So, and at that time, there was very little research done on circadian rhythm. So that's how I got interested in a field where the field is very small and at that time, and I thought this will be a cool area to get in because in future there's a lot of potential for discovery and interventions based on biological timing.
Okay, and then your PhD work was at the Scripps, is that?
Yeah, so actually I started a PhD program in Winnipeg, Manitoba,
Oh,
because my other interest was how some plant proteins become allergen. We eat plant proteins every day, but why certain plant proteins become allergen? And that came from my work with vanilla beans because I saw there are many people who work in the vanilla field, they become allergic to vanilla beans.
interesting.
And the same thing, so there are two curiosity that came from there. One was vanilla flowers around 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning. So people who work in the vanilla field, they get up around 1 or 2 o'clock and then go to the field and work. And if you talk to those workers, they'll say, well, initially we are all healthy. Maybe this nighttime waking up and not sleeping enough makes us prone to this allergic reaction. Means that was just what their thought was. So that's why I got interested in this timing and allergy. And I
Yeah.
started this in Winnipeg and then quickly realized that it's not a good idea to move from southern part of India where the temperature in summertime goes to 100-degree plus to move to a place where the temperature was minus 30 degrees centigrade. So
Yeah, I'm from Minnesota, so I grew up in the cold weather, but
yeah.
yeah, and then I was in Texas for a number of years, and it was a big shock going to 100 degrees from
Yeah.
cooler. So, okay,
So
and
that's when I
then
came to Scripps for my PhD. And that time, again, I realized that Arabidopsis had a small genome compared to mouse or human. So if there are mutations, these are the pre-genomic era when the genome was not known.
yeah,
And people are still trying to figure out how the clock works. What are the clock genes? How do they talk to each other? How timing is encoded? So they were doing what geneticists would do. They mutagenized plants and found plants that have altered clock, a long, slow running clock or a fast running clock. And I realized that if we work on this kind of altered clock, then we can figure out what the gene is, and then subsequently, and by that time, it was in early 90s. To be fair, by that time, the clock circadian mutants were already identified in Drosophila, in fungi, and also in cyanobacteria. And in Drosophila, they had a fairly rough idea of how the clock might be working. But what became very clear was the clock in cyanobacteria and fungi or in Drosophila were very different from each other. At least the components were different, but the principle might be same. So that means in plants, we are hoping that we'll find something new components and the mechanism may be similar. So that was an exciting time to be in.
so in the plants, what kind of circadian changes occur in the plant? I know plants breathe at night, right? These on the under part of the leaves, these pores open up and exchange CO2 and oxygen. And then during the day, those close. What else is circadian in the plant?
I mean, if I put a single line, if plants did not have circadian rhythm, no animal forms would be possible on this planet.
Yeah.
The reason is plants actually, the plant circadian clock uh, optimizes carbon fixation on our planet. So that means before the sun rises, the clock in plants tell the carbon fixing mechanisms, that's the chlorophylls and rubisco, etc., all these molecules that harvest light energy and fix them into carbohydrate. All those genes are turned on 1 or 2 hours before sun rises, so that as soon as sun is up, the plants are able to harvest the first ray of light.
Huh.
And then before sunset, 1 or 2 hours before sunset, the plant also shuts down its kitchen. So they begin to shut down the kitchen so that by the time the sun sets, the plants are not wasting any extra energy to keep the kitchen running. So in that way, you are increasing carbon fixation by, it's based on many guesstimates, it's somewhere between 10 to 15% carbon fixation is increased. And if you think about all the cyanobacteria, all the plants, photosynthetic bacteria, to large banyan tree, they're doing the same thing. That's a huge amount of carbon fixation. Second is many plants move their leaves in a way that they can maximize sunlight capture. So plants actually move their leaves up and down. And some plants are very obvious, some may not be. And this is almost like, the modern, very fancy solar panels that can also move with the sun to increase capture of the solar energy to convert into energy to light up your house. So similarly, plants actually have figured this out a million years ago. The
And
clocks.
have the geneticists been able to manipulate plants so that their amount of carbon fixation is increased?
So there is another huge aspect of plant growth and reproduction. That is, almost all of us know that different plants flower in different seasons. So the reason they do that is they use their internal circadian clock to measure how many hours of sunlight is out there.
Oh, yeah.
And by measuring the sunlight hours, they decide when to flower and when to fruit.
So that's not circadian, that's ultradian. Is that the right term?
No,
No.
it's seasonal rhythm, but seasonal rhythms arise from circadian clocks, because plants who do not have circadian clocks, they also become insensitive to photoperiod.
Oh, okay.
So you cannot induce flowering at the proper time by photoperiod alone. You need both the circadian clock, internal clock, and the seasonal change in lighting. So now imagine what could happen if plants don't have a circadian clock. Actually, it's to our advantage, because almost all the modern crops that we grow, starting from wheat, if you think about the wheat green revolution started when plant breeders could grow wheat in all three different seasons, because inadvertently, without knowing, they might have broken the circadian clock in these wheat varieties, or altered the circadian clock in these varieties that allowed them to grow wheat in three different seasons. And now almost all major crops, grains, can be grown in all, irrespective of day length, because of this manipulation, inadvertent manipulation of circadian clock. The second thing that happens is clocks also allow plants to expand during the day and divide at night. And if you tweak that, then you can increase biomass production. And the best examples that have been described is some of the F1 hybrids, which are high yielding varieties. They have a alteration with the circadian clock, again, inadvertently, because plant breeders actually didn't know. what they're doing.
Yeah.
But they selected for these varieties which have an altered circadian clock so that these plants now grow much faster. They can flower and set seeds or fruits much quicker because of this altered circadian. So in that way, if you think about the impact of circadian clock on, we can see food production, energy security, because if you want to increase biomass production for alternate energy through other kind of mechanisms, for example, algae, biofuel, etc., you can also use this.
I was thinking from the standpoint of carbon capture from the
Carbon
atmosphere.
capture too,
Yeah.
and then ecosystem restoration. So, for example, if you want to restore an ecosystem in northern latitude versus equator, you got to choose the right type of plants that can thrive in those photoperiod.
Yeah.
So in that way, the plant circadian rhythms have a huge impact on ecosystems, food production,
Yeah.
energy security, carbon capture, all of this.
Yeah.
Sorry, it was a long
then,
answer.
no, this is good. And then, so at the Scripps, your PhD work, what was your main finding? I guess is a question.
Yeah, so I tend to kind of tinker with many things. One
Okay.
thing was my primary project was to figure out what one of the clock circadian mutant, which had long periods. So that means the clock was running slower. What is the gene? And that led to the cloning of that particular gene, which turned out to be a poly-ADP ribose glycohydrolase. So to make a long story short, that gene connected NAD metabolism to circadian clock. And that was the first time, because right now it's very well accepted that NAD metabolism is reciprocally linked to circadian clock in mammals. But in 2001, 2002, when we published that paper, the cloning of this gene, we called it TES because of some phenotype. But it turned out to establish the link between NAD metabolism and clock. At the same time, I also worked on cloning another gene in the lab that turned out to be TOC1, which was a core transcriptional regulator of the clock in plants. And I also worked on light signaling. There are two phytochromes and cryptochromes. These are different sets of proteins that sense red or blue light in plants, and how they interact with each other I also contributed to. So in some way, by working on 3 or 4 different projects, it helped me to understand the genetics of anything. So when we are doing in those pre-genomic era chromosome walking or position-based cloning, it didn't matter whether we are doing it in plants or animals. The principles, the concepts were very similar. It also helped me appreciate the value of sequencing the genome, because I clearly remember the day the human genome was released. The paper came out, and I was holding that issue of Science, and I could feel the shiver going through my spine. I was realizing, wow, no one from now on had to go through all the tough work that I had to do on positional cloning in the Arabidopsis plant. And it completely changed how we think about science.
And
It also
at
gave
that
me
point, was it
yeah.
then about 20? At that point, did you start thinking about timing of food intake? And
No, I think that came a little bit later. So what
yeah,
happened was it also gave me appreciation of how light signaling, like in plants, light signaling affects a lot of plant physiology. But at that time, we knew very little about lighting and how light enters the circadian clock in mammals.
yeah,
So right after my PhD, I moved to Genomics Institute of Novartis Foundation, which now has become part of Novartis Biomedical Research. And that's where, again, that's where I was very lucky to be in GNF at that time, because we as postdocs, we did not have to write grants, we didn't have to do teaching, RA or anything. We purely had to work on what excited us.
I've been in that position too.
Yeah. But at the same time, the postdoc was only 36 months. So the
Ah,
clock starts ticking right away.
yeah.
And there was also another inflection point or kind of life-changing experience that time. 9/11 happened. And that's the time GNF had applied for my H-1B visa application.
Hmm.
And 9/12, when everybody was depressed and we were thinking about what a horrible thing happened, in the afternoon, the head of HR walked towards my desk. And I was thinking, gosh, they must have refused my H-1B and I have to go back to India. But then, because the head of HR never walked downstairs from her office, no one ever saw her walking through the lab. And then she came up to me and said, congratulations,
Oh,
your
good.
visa was approved. Then I was thinking, who in the right mind would go to department? That time it was not Department of Homeland Security, but the equivalent department in DC, it would go and approve this H-1B from a foreign researcher. So
Well,
this
like not
country,
everyone in this country is xenophobic, I don't think.
no, it was not about xenophobia. It was like the whole country was in a shock.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
In a shock. It's not about xenophobia or anything. It's about how, when we could not work that day, and how can some, so this country is so resilient, and I got this almost like a gift, like a lifeline to
Yeah.
stay in this country. So
So
that's
the
what,
point is everybody kept working.
yeah, everybody kept working, and then I said, well, I got to pay back, so I got to work hard. So that's the
Well,
time when I started in GNF, and there were two big things that came out. One was the discovery of melanopsin, the blue light sensing light receptor, and that's the year when we made the knockout, and we showed that we were the first one to show that melanopsin is the dominant circadian photoreceptor in mammals. Period. We are the first one to show that, and then that led to research about melanopsin, whether it's a blue light photoreceptor, and in the next 2 years, all those papers were published. At the same time, I was also, there was the
now everybody's heard of rods and cones, right? In the retina.
yeah, so there are, in a human retina, there are nearly 10 to 15 million rod and cone cells. They give us the um, vision of the world, but then there are many blind people. Unfortunately, they have lost their rod and cone cells. They cannot see the world, but they can sense light.
Ah,
So that means when they fly from east coast to west coast, vice versa, they can reset their clock to the local time, just like the normal people do. And there are many blind animals who have lost rod and cones, but they can entrain their circadian rhythm to seasonal changes and for the period or in experimentally when we change circadian rhythm. So that was a curiosity, that was a mystery in vision science for almost 70 years, how these animals can sense light.
yeah.
And again, going back to the genome project, because after the human and mouse genomes were sequenced, we found the potential opsin, rhodopsin, or conopsin like molecules called melanopsin, which was present in frog melanosomes, frog skin. And we assumed that this may be the missing link. So that was a high risk project because in plants, I had seen that almost every photoreceptor in plants are hooked to the clock. And here I thought, well, I'll try on melanopsin, but at that time we also knew there are other opsins in the genome. So what if this is not the opsin? So, so this was kind of a high risk project, but it turned out to pay off. But at the same time, I tend to tinker with many things. So in parallel, I asked a very simple question. By that time, we knew the central mechanism of circadian clock in animals, plants, Drosophila, cyanobacteria, and fungi. But the question was, if clock is based on this handful of dozen of genes, how do clocks regulate such complex physiology, such as sleep-wake cycle in brain, digestive rhythm in the body, heart rate, and all that stuff? There must be genes that are downstream of the clock. And that time, there are new technologies coming out to measure not one, two, but hundreds or even thousands of genes and their expression levels simultaneously by cDNA microarrays or API oligo arrays. And so that's the time when we decided to see what are the circadian regulated genes in the suprachiasmatic nucleus. That's the part of the hypothalamus that acts as the master circadian clock, and also in the liver, mouse liver. So we
And,
essentially
and,
said,
and the hypothalamus is kind of the bottom part of the brain, and it plays critical role in regulating endocrine glands in the periphery, glands that produce hormones such as cortisol.
yeah,
And yeah,
growth
so
hormones.
it's important in controlling the circadian rhythms of these hormonal systems, right?
Yeah, so the circadian, the master circadian clock in humans and mammals is, and there's 20,000 neurons that are actually compactly situated right above the optic chiasma. So we know that the optic nerves from our eyes, they crisscross at the base of the brain. So that's called the optic chiasma, and this is right above the optic chiasma, hence the name suprachiasmatic nucleus. And the reason why it is still called nucleus is in 50s, 60s, and 70s, neuroscientists thought that there are different centers in the brain or nuclei in the brain that control different aspects of our physiology, behavior, and metabolism, just like you said. And that came from the idea that, for example, the pituitary gland is connected to the brain, but it's a very distinct center. Similarly, pineal gland is connected to the brain. It's at the top of the brain. It's a distinct part. So similarly, people thought that there are specific part of the brain, and they started ablating those parts to see if you remove specific part of the brain, then what happens. You can remove a chunk of the cortex and chunk of many different parts of the brain, not much happens. But as you mentioned, if you start removing parts of hypothalamus, then a lot of things can happen.
Yeah.
So that's why the arcuate nucleus is still existent, because when you remove that part, then the hunger, satiety, all these controls are disrupted. Similarly, if you remove the suprachiasmatic nucleus, this is the size of a pin, the tip of a pin almost, not even the head, the tip. Then
Yeah.
the mice become completely arrhythmic. So they have no sense of day or night. They cannot sleep correctly. They sleep for 1 or 2 hours, then wake up and run and sleep for 1 and 2 hours. They have no sense of light. So that's why that's called the master circadian clock, suprachiasmatic nucleus.
And nevertheless, those mice without the suprachiasmatic neurons that respond indirectly to light, those mice still, if you take cells from the periphery and look at the expression of genes and these clock genes, they still have the clock. Is that right?
Yeah, so so they do have clock, and I'll get to that, how that is transforming our study of circadian rhythm. So the idea was, well, initially people thought that that's the only clock in mammals, but then that clock drives all the other. Even that time there was a name called, there was, even people used to call all the other clocks as slave oscillator, the master oscillator and slave oscillator. There are even reviews written on that. And there are beautiful sets of experiments done in late 90s and early 2000, when people chopped off parts of the Drosophila, and they found that Drosophila legs, wings, and proboscis, mouth, every independent chopped part had its own circadian rhythm, so they could cycle. Similarly, even individual cells have their own circadian clock. So that means the clock, the basic fundamental timing mechanism, is encoded in every cell.
But maybe that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. This morning, I just got on I went on PubMed, which is what I usually go on, and I kind of put in paramecium, circadian, and so on. And so if you go back in the literature, and this is way before the genome was sequenced and stuff, it was clear that bacteria, single cell organisms, they do have
Yeah.
Clocks. They do change. For example, mating, timing of mating is on a circadian basis in paramecium and so on.
Yeah.
So maybe that makes sense when you get multicellular organisms, that the clocks are retained.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so that's why there are many behavior, for example, those are present in humans and mice, and it's very difficult to reduce that to individual cells. Whereas the circadian rhythm and sleep wake, we always think circadian rhythms is sleep wake, and then it must be in the brain. We don't think about the other parts. So that's why it was a big surprise that circadian rhythms are present in every cell. So that's why we decided to do this experiment to look at which genes are turned on and off at different times of the day or night. It's a very simple experiment, but it led to the discovery of hundreds of genes that turn on and off at different times in the liver and the SCN. But what was interesting was the genes that are cycling in the SCN were different from the genes that are cycling in the liver, except for the core clock genes. So then it brings up another issue, because we mostly think gene regulation is locus specific. So that means if A regulates B,
Right.
A must regulate B in the brain and also in the stomach or liver. But here it became very clear that the mechanism by which clock regulates cellular physiology or neuronal function in the SCN, the set of genes it regulates in the SCN is very different from the set of genes it regulates in liver. So that also opened a lot of, sorry.
Can it be explained simply by tissue-specific repressors that prevent the clock gene products from activating those genes?
Yeah, so that question is still open, how clocks regulate tissue-specific manner, because in some cases there are downstream components maybe interacting with another tissue-specific factor, or they may be interacting themselves with tissues, as you mentioned, tissue-specific repressor, tissue-specific activators. So it just opened up a lot of very fundamental questions about the temporal regulation of gene expression. It's not about locus specific gene expression, temporal regulation, and also tissue specific expression. And the genes that are commonly cycling between the SCN and liver, since they were already enriched for clock genes, it also raised another question, that maybe this is a gold mine for discovering additional clock genes, which were not discovered by then. So that led to discovery of many additional clock genes. But in the liver, what became very clear was there were a set of genes that were cycling. They peaked in the nighttime, and some sets they were peaking during daytime. And some of the genes were described as feeding induced or fasting induced. So that led me to think that many of the circadian regulated genes may be actually interacting, just like you said, tissue-specific factor. There might be tissue-specific pathways or signaling components that respond to feeding, that respond to fasting in the liver, that are interacting somehow with the clock components to produce these rhythms. So that led to, again, many discoveries in my group and also in many collaborators or independent groups, connecting circadian clock mechanisms with fasting signals. So for example, crave, glucagon, or feeding signal, for example, insulin, mTOR pathway, and also to other signals, nutrient signals, for example, NAD redox state. So the idea is you can do a very simple experiment, and it can lead to a lot of hypotheses, and that those hypotheses can be tested for the next 10 years or 15 years. This was possible only because I was in Novartis. Because if I had written the grant to NIH saying that I will do the gene expression analysis and will discover something, the NIH reviewers would have said, no, it's not hypothesis driven research, and we are not going to give you money.
Yeah, when I reviewed grants for NIH, we referred to this as stamp collecting.
Yeah, stamp collection or fishing expedition.
Fishing expedition.
Yeah. I would have never gotten funding for that
Yeah,
particular.
that's
But that's my
unfortunate.
highest cited paper, 2,000 plus citation. It's still counting. And not only that, right after that, many people actually replicated that study in independent systems or independent programs, independent platforms, different tissue types. And that has been those gene expression profiling, circadian gene expression profiling, have been the, if you go back, those were the inflection point in circadian rhythm research.
Yeah.
Between discovery of the clock genes and understanding how clock genes regulate behavior, physiology, and metabolism in different organs, the linchpin was this stamp collection or hypothesis generating experiments.
Well, you have to collect the stamps before you can understand where they came from and what they do.
No, like for example, even the
Right?
genome,
If you don't
even
collect
the
the
genome
stamps, you're
sequencing,
lost.
even the genome sequencing was not hypothesis driven. There was no hypothesis behind genome sequencing. So this is, I mean, if there are reviewers listening to it, you got to ask yourself, like, have you ever used any data from a stamp collection experiment? And why did you use that data if you hate stamp collection?
You know,
So,
in a sense, it is hypothesis driven, and that is as follows: that
yeah,
that by doing this gene sequencing, and in relation to circadian rhythms, you're providing.
yeah,
The hypothesis is that the data generated from that will be invaluable for future studies.
yeah. But when I review,
No, I know.
for that.
I know.
So this has been extremely frustrating because most of the stuff that I do was most of my most exciting papers were always rejected by NIH reviewers. Most of my boring studies are highly liked by the NIH reviewers. So that is the conundrum, but that's okay. I mean, this is the way science is. But coming back to the point, so that's what happened. That two different discoveries. One, how light enters the brain clock, and second, how the clock regulates physiology, metabolism, or behavior in different organs by genomic changes, genome-wide changes in gene expression. That came out of my postdoc. And then when I started my lab, there was enough hypothesis to test. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely. And right, so why don't we diverge just a little bit and talk about human health and circadian rhythms, which is a very important topic. We can go back and talk about your work in animals, but you're now doing work in humans, and this is very important for human health. So, spend 10, 15 minutes talking about that.
Well, the origin of circadian rhythm, the real question is, why do we have circadian rhythm?
Yeah.
Why do we have this 24 hours rhythm? And the reason is because of the rotation of our planet around its axis.
Sure.
And since the planet is tilted and it rotates in an elliptical circle path, there is also seasonal change because most humans nowadays, they live away from the equator, and a lot of plants and animals are also away from the equator. So that means between day and night, although we are living in air-conditioned environment nowadays, but for most parts, for last 200,000 years, except for the last, if you remove the 150 years, most part humans lived in nature. So that means there was a strong change, there was a profound change in light and dark. because they had to venture out to do agriculture, collect food, hunt. All the outdoor activities had to be done under some kind of sunlight or in the shade. And that amount of light people are getting exposed to, even under shade in a cloudy day, was 5,000 to 10,000 lux. And in a sunny day, it was around 100 to 200,000 lux. And if you're a fisherman spending whole day fishing, then you're exposed to 100 to 200,000 lux of light for 8 to 10 hours. And at night time, it was pitch dark. Light was very scarce because you have to collect a lot of firewood to light up the first 2 to 3 hours of the evening. It was expensive. Means you have to cook or grill, and you cannot keep the light going for most of the evening. And there is a big change in temperature. So there is a light dark change. There's a temperature change at least 10 degrees centigrade.
Yeah.
Or 15-degree Fahrenheit change between peak to nighttime. Now with that, the humidity also changed. The dew point was very different between night and daytime. Predators were also very different because at nighttime humans had to run back to the cave and hide. So all of these imposed a kind of selection process so that humans and animals and almost every living organism had to adapt to this very predictable, reproducible change in environment. So that's why we evolved to have this internal clock. So then the question is, what are the advantages of the clock? What did that tell us? What are the basic sets of principles that are governed by the circadian rhythm? So the point is, our day is not same as night, and we all know that the type of Mark Madsen I talk to in the middle of the day will be very different from if I wake you up at 1 o'clock in the night. We won't have this conversation. We'll be so, and you would have gone through several hours. Means you are different, but an average person would can go through 8 hours of fasting at night time without feeling hungry. But during daytime, going through 8 hours without food is very stressful for a lot of people. So physiology, metabolism, behavior, everything is very different between day and night. To adapt to this day and night rhythm at a very macroscopic level. In a microscopic level, what happens is, going back to my master's thesis work on nitrogen fixation, I told you how oxidative and reductive processes happen in the same cell, and it happens in many cells. But they cannot happen, theoretically, they cannot happen at the same time in the same space. So circadian clock temporally separates incompatible processes. And at a macroscopic level, for example, our bowel movement is most likely in the first half of the day.
Yeah.
Just imagine if our bowel movement was likely in the middle of our sleep, it will be so uncomfortable. So at a macroscopic level, our physiology, our metabolism is so different. We have the daytime activities, our body does something that the body doesn't want to do at nighttime. Similarly, our muscles become almost they don't our sensory system, it increases its threshold, so it doesn't respond to sensory stimulation at night, so that we can actually go through sleep. But daytime, it has to have very high sensory activity so that we can respond to dangers. So circadian clock temporarily separates incompatible processes from individual cells to whole organism.
The nighttime is a time when probably throughout our body and brain cells recover from the challenges they face during the day, muscles.
Yeah, so you're bringing up the second point, that is reset, repair, and rejuvenate.
Yeah.
So for example, daytime, our skin is exposed to a lot of UV light, and you don't want to divide cells because the single stranded DNA will be exposed to UV during day. So that's why in almost every organism, whether it's day active or night active, the S phase of the cell cycle is usually, most predominantly happens at night time. So that's the first line of repair or rejuvenation. And similarly, almost all repairs, a lot of repairs actually happen at night time. We are very familiar with synaptic processes that happen at night time. So the bottom line is, if you imagine, our body is a very complex system and it has to repair and reset. Just like our car has to repair, we have to take the car to the repair shop every few months. Similarly, our body has to repair, and it's an auto repair process, and that happens at night time. And the circadian clock times it so that it happens at night. Then the third one is anticipation, and this is a huge thing. And the best way to connect anticipation is, for example, if we know that we have to catch a flight at 8 o'clock, we anticipate, we know already the plane will start at 8 o'clock. We need to be at the gate 7:30. We have to go through security, maybe starting at 6:30. So we prepare ourselves by waking up at 4:30 or 5, depending on how much is the travel time.
Yeah.
So similarly, every day our body anticipates when we are going to get up. So before that, the heart has to pump up extra faster, our breathing has to go up, our core body temperature has to warm up so that when we wake up, we feel fresh. So when you have a good night's sleep and you wake up and you feel rested, that means your circadian clock has actually prepared you to wake up fully rejuvenated and fresh. And that's the reason why if you put an alarm clock and you wake up, you don't feel right, because you are not fully awake, your body is not prepared. Although in these days, you are not exposed to predators waiting outside your driveway, but imagine for 200,000 years, that was what was happening. Humans, when they wake up in the morning, they had to be fully alert. Their muscles, their ligaments, their motor system, their lungs, their heart should be at the peak to get out and fight with potential predator waiting outside. So this anticipation is extremely important. And so now we can see there are at least 3 or 4 different types of potential advantages of having circadian rhythm. So similarly, homeostasis, when we think of homeostasis we describe as the kind of the constant state that our body returns to. And we always think that homeostasis is at a set point, but it's not. Even if we think about core body temperature, and if we say that's say 98.x, that's actually not 98 degree at the middle of the day and middle of the night. A body temperature has to cycle, and there is a very nice homeostatic range of cycling that helps other aspects. So for example, synchronizing all the systems in our body. So these are fundamental processes that happen. So now we fast forward and see what happened in modern days and what are the circadian rhythm disruption. Let's put it this way: the controlled use of fire was the inflection point that differentiates humans from all other species.
Yeah.
Because we could control fire, we could stay safe, and fire or light also helped people to explore. In old days, most of the wars were fought at night time. Surprise attack on your enemy at night time was an advantage. Explorers who could navigate through stars and had controlled use of fire to light up the nighttime, and they are the ones who went and discovered new islands, new continents. And then for societal safety, people who stayed awake at nighttime, they stayed guard against predators or against the enemy. And the more people in your community or in your clan who could stay awake at nighttime gave us that prosperity and safety to the community. And conversely, thieves who could stay awake at nighttime and exploit other people sleeping, they also benefited. So nighttime activity became the key to establish superiority against your peers, against your enemies, and to accumulate wealth. So that's why we are hooked to night. And also, nighttime activity is very different from daytime activity. And there are many anthropologists who have gone to hunter-gatherer communities and they have listened to what people even talk between day and night. And it's very different. Daytime, people talk about their work and all the politics that goes on, all the conflict, and how to grow food, how to hunt, all that stuff that happened. But the fireside chat was very different. People talked about arts, culture, science, philosophy, performing art. People danced, people sang. So what makes us human? The cradle of human civilization actually happened at nighttime chat, fireside chat, and after the evening. So that's why we are addicted to night.
Yeah.
But lighting of the night was very expensive. In the middle of 19th century, an average family in the UK, in England, would spend up to a week's worth of their income to light up their entire house for 4 to 5 hours in the evening. So that means the mass did not actually stay awake late into the night, but those who could, they could benefit. And then if you think about the Industrial Revolution, when the factory started churning out products, I realized that why to keep the factory running only for 8 hours? Let's run it for 24 hours. And a factory that runs for 24 hours has a huge advantage over the factory that runs only for 8 to 12 hours. So that led
Now,
to.
does your laboratory run for 24 hours?
Yes, we had to collect samples. Well, we have seen that in all our labs. The postdocs who stay beyond 6 o'clock in the evening, they are the ones who go out and get the jobs. Or who come very early in the morning and put that extra 3 to 4 hours work.
What is it? Is it the expense of their health?
Well, so this is the thing that, so we'll get to that. So now what happens is shift work becomes the way a society, a culture, or a nation can have an edge over the others. And in modern days now, nearly 20% of workers in industrialized countries like US and UK and many parts of Europe, nearly 20% of people do shift work. So that means they stay awake. The International Labour Organization, their rough definition is if you stay awake for 2 hours between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. and are engaged in an activity, you just don't have to keep your eyes open in the bed, but you're actually working for 2 hours for 50 days in a year, then you are considered to be a shift worker. So now if you go back to say 1950s or 60s or 70s, it was mostly the shift worker who went to work at night time. They were living the lifestyle of a shift worker. But over the last 40, 50 years, this has completely transformed because we are now hooked to rectangular pieces of glowing objects and 24 hours television, 24 hours entertainment, and our ability to connect with people in real time over several time zones away has enabled all of us to live the life of a shift worker. And also the pressure on human productivity is so high that there is a very thin or blurred line between our work life and private life, personal life. So then there is a huge pressure for us to stay awake late into the night. it is also institutionalized in some ways or the other. For example, I'm sure in Hopkins, the deadline for undergrad students to submit their assignment is now midnight.
Yeah, it is.
Just a few years ago, before the digital age, it used to be 5 p.m. Only after we have access to high-speed internet, Wi-Fi, and since people are all doing their homework through the on the computer, only in the last 10 years, I would say, we have seen shift work like lifestyle has been institutionalized in high school students and college students. So that means starting from the age of 12, 13, or 14, we are forcing our teenagers to stay awake late into the night. We have made it now a rule, almost like a norm, that they have to stay awake till midnight to submit their assignment.
And it's not only the policies that have changed, but also the peer pressure.
Yeah,
At least like with graduate students at Hopkins, right?
yeah,
You go into any lab in the evening, there's a lot of graduate students and postdocs there.
yeah.
And, so there's kind of this sort of, yeah, it's a psychological thing, essentially.
Yeah, so it boils down to the same old thought that people who stay awake at night and work more have an advantage on other people who work less. And now that we all want to outpace ourselves, we want to stay awake late into the night. And universities.
I did the opposite my whole career. I got up really early in the morning.
Yeah, I wake up
I
also.
was most productive in the morning.
Yeah.
And then in the evening, I'd go to bed by 10 pretty much every night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But now I think this policy of universities and high schools to have this assignment submission time to midnight
Yeah, that's not good.
is an institutionalization of circadian disruption starting from teenage.
Yeah.
And this has to be discussed and debated at a larger scale to make sure to figure out, can we give people because what happens is after they submit the assignment, they're not going back to sleep. They're actually staying awake because we have to go back to what is this fireside chat.
Yeah.
Fireside chat is to feel independent, to feel free from the burdens of the day.
To wind down.
We all want to wind down,
Yeah.
do something, relax. People say, okay, I want to finish work and then have a glass of wine and relax.
Yeah.
So nobody says I'll finish work and then I'll just hit the bed. Very few people do that. People want to do something. So,
Yeah.
so this is something that's very disruptive. So now going back to the circadian clock, if we have an internal clock, then it should be always kicking, and these things should not disturb our clock. But actually, it's not true. Now going back to the tilt of our planet along its axis and seasonal change, that means our clocks are plastic enough to respond to seasonal changes in light, darkness, food availability, temperature, and even physical activity. So that means our clocks are designed to respond to changes in lighting. As the summer days become longer, our clocks have to adapt, and vice versa. So now we are kind of living in perpetual twilight zone, because we never go out. We rarely go out to enjoy few hours of sunlight or even daylight. We are always indoors, so we don't get enough light during the daytime, and we get bright light, relatively bright light in the nighttime. And since our clocks are designed to respond to that light suppresses sleep.
Yeah.
And light always disrupts our clock. Our clocks get confused whether it's day, night, morning, or evening. So then what happens is, when there are complex feed-forward regulation here, because when our brain is not getting enough time to sleep, then brain doesn't know how long the person is going to stay awake, because the brain knows that the person should be sleeping for 7 to 8 hours, but the person hasn't slept at the usual time, and the brain doesn't know how long the person is going to stay awake. So it turns on the hunger center to make sure that the person actually eats enough to stay awake. So that's why sleep disruption makes us hungry. Not only hungry, we also lose our power to decide what is good and bad, because it also disrupts our decision making process. And
You
since
know, that's, again, this morning I was looking back at some articles, and what you just said reminded me that one where this was back in, I think, the late 60s in Japanese group, scheduled feeding, which is actually, turns out, time restricted feeding, and trains daily rhythms of, oh no, not that one. Scheduled feeding causes activation of dopamine metabolism in the striatum. And
yeah,
we all know dopamine is a neurotransmitter associated with addiction, including food addiction,
mhm.
and so on. So this ties into what you're saying.
Yeah, this one is sleep deprivation. So when we sleep less, our hunger goes up, and we tend to overeat.
Yeah.
We tend to consume more food than what is needed to stay awake.
And we're probably getting more of a, more rewarding effect
Yeah,
of the food.
maybe. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that would be interesting to check also. And at the same time, since our liver and our digestive system is not ready, they were actually going to sleep or going to repair themselves when we eat at the wrong
Yeah.
time, then it also
That's,
disrupts that repair process. And then the question is, are we seeing some changes in disease trend or something that reflects this? And actually, if you talk to any pediatrician, they'll tell that the incidence of irritable bowel syndrome, where people go to the bathroom too many times, have indigestion, etc., that is rising very fast among teenagers and college students.
huh.
Of course, the pediatrician report stuff up to the age of 18, so they're saying that they have seen this stomach problem and indigestion, digestive system issues.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Esophageal reflux.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then if we go to shift worker who are doing shift work, although there are 20% of people who are doing officially shift work, there are also another 10% of people like you and I. Of course, you sleep at 10 o'clock, but I don't sleep at 10 o'clock. And also, there are many of us who travel at least 50 times a year. So if you're
Wow.
doing 2 trips in a month, that's 4 days of travel,
Yeah.
and that's 50 days of disruption.
So
So
what are you doing then personally to keep your clock in like the ideal?
yeah, so that led to this idea that, well, we cannot control lighting too much. And coming back to the timing of food intake, another thing that became very clear was in 2009, we did a simple experiment. We fed mice during the daytime. Mice are night feeders, they're nocturnal.
Yeah.
And we asked a very simple question: if the SCN controls circadian rhythm in periphery, because until that time, they're still thinking that liver is a slave oscillator to the SCN. So that means SCN tells the liver
Right.
genes when they should cycle.
Mm-hmm.
But if the liver has to digest food at the right time and the food is presented at the wrong time, then what happens? So we fed mice during daytime. And again, we went back to the same genomics tool to ask what happens in the liver. And what we found was very surprising and gratifying to us. So one is, no, all the cycling genes, the genes that cycle in the liver, they tracked food. So that means the genes that are peaking at the night time when mice habitually eat, now they started to peak in the morning when we fed mice during daytime, and vice versa. So that's when the light bulb went up, and we said, ha. So forget, and imagine these mice are in light dark cycle. So the light is still the strong circadian antenna, the SCN clock is intact, all the signals from the brain is coming to tell liver you should be cycling in one way, but the food overrode all those signals from the brain and said, no, you got to listen to liver clock, you got to listen when food is coming. So until that time, people are thinking that to address full proposal, address the circadian disruption, then you have to address lighting and sleep. But now the food effect on circadian rhythm changed that dialogue, and we thought, no, to fix circadian disruption, we just have to focus on food. And it was good that in the subsequent years, there are many different labs that did the similar experiment. They mistimed feed the mice, and they went even beyond liver. They looked at all the peripheral organs, even the mouse brain, and found that the clocks in almost every part of the body and also the brain, excluding the SCN, track food. So that means even in the hypothalamus, right outside, just a few millimeters away from the SCN, all those brain regions were tracking food. So that's when we decided that, well, let's see if we feed mice within a fixed time every day, without reducing their calories, without changing the quality of food they eat, what will be its impact? So that led to this very, I guess that's the best experiment I had done in second best experiment in the last 10 years. That was exactly done. That was published 2012 June, so exactly 10 years ago. So the experiment was simple. We took two groups of mice. They're born in the same room, they were same age, same genotype, and had the same microbiome, ate the same number of calories, at the same quality of food. The only difference was the first group was allowed to eat whenever they wanted. They ate a little bit during daytime, nearly 65% during nighttime. And then the second group was allowed to eat only within 8 hours interval. And mice within 3 to 4 days that quickly learn, they will eat the same number of calories as they usually eat within these 8 hours. So then, and the next, and we gave a very unhealthy food. So this food was 63% fat, and then a lot of simple sugar, 12% protein, which will be equivalent to a human eating nachos and ice cream for all breakfast, lunch, and dinner, all the meals. And we knew that this food makes mice very unhealthy. They become obese, diabetic, and there are 9,000 papers published on the term called diet-induced obesity, where people give this unhealthy diet to mice that leave them out food in the hopper. And to our surprise, after 18 weeks, the mice that ate within 8 hours the same number of calories, the same identical food, they were completely protected from obesity, diabetes, heart disease, etc. They looked almost as if they were eating healthy diet. And we are surprised. So that's why I asked another postdoc in the lab to repeat the experiment. So we repeated the experiment 3-4 times. And every time the result was same and it was a big change in nutrition science, because until that time, we knew that the number of calories matter, because if we reduce calorie intake, and you are a pioneer in that field, then we can reduce many burdens of disease and can keep the mouse alive for a long time. If we improve diet quality, for example, if we reduce bad fat and increase better protein and better carbohydrate, complex carbohydrate, we can also make mice healthy, humans healthy. But the timing was never examined that way. So it was hard to get the paper published.
I had Mike Anson and Ruchin Wan in my lab. We had a PNAS paper in 1993 where we, as you know, our model of intermittent fasting was every other day fasting. So 24 hours no food, 24 hours food.
Yeah.
And we found in a certain strain of mouse we used, line what we had, when we fed them every other day, on the day they did have food, they ate about pretty much twice as much food as they would normally eat in a day. So over the long term, they were not calorie restricted. And we found that intermittent fasting regimen without calorie restriction was neuroprotective in model of seizures. And we also looked at glucose regulation, insulin. So there are improvements in insulin sensitivity. So those studies associated at least some beneficial effects of intermittent fasting from calorie intake. And then also, Rafa DeCabo, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, my friend. So it turns out that most, if not all, published calorie restriction studies are also daily time restricted eating studies. And the reason is, this has been looked at critically by Ananda Labs. The way they do the studies is, say you have group 20 animals, and you determine how many food pellets they eat each day. Then you divide them into two groups. And one group you give, say, 30% less food each day. So that's the calorie restriction. But you give it to them all at once. And when you give it to them all at once, they consume all their food within a 4 to 6 hour time window. So they're actually, and so that raises the issue. And in all of the published calorie restriction studies, what's the contribution of daily time restricted eating versus calorie restriction to, these remarkable extension of lifespan and health benefits?
Yeah.
That's kind of an open question still.
No, I think that field is expanding very quickly. So 2 points to time restricted feeding does not reduce calorie for any 24 hours. So,
right.
So it's when people argue that alternate day fasting is same as time restricted feeding, I take issue with that because
no, I'm not arguing
reduce
that.
Calorie on any one day.
No, I'm not arguing that. I'm arguing that most of daily calorie restriction studies are also time restricted.
Presentations I see people say intermittent fasting, time restricted eating is one form of intermittent fasting. Sorry, intermittent fasting is a very broad term.
Right.
Essentially, the term intermittent essentially doesn't say anything about timing. It just says you can randomly go and fast for any length of time.
Right.
It does not say that you have to be consistently eating within that window.
Right. But what I'm saying is the calorie restriction studies are daily time restricted eating because the animals consume all of their food within a 4 to 6 hour time window.
Yes. So that I will get to that one. So, So again, most of the calorie restriction studies are also done in normal chow. Very few, if any, are done in a diet that most Western people consume. That's 35% plus fat and then bad carbohydrate and some protein. Coming back to your point, yes, that's true. And that's actually Joe Takahashi in 2017, 2018 published a beautiful paper showing, as you pointed out, almost all caloric restriction studies in mammals, not in Drosophila, but in mouse and rats, do this. Then the question is,
and there was also a much earlier paper in 1990 by Duffy et al. Where they showed that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But this was, again, Joe Takahashi recently published another paper which addressed your question.
Yeah.
How much lifespan extension you'll get only by calorie restriction?
Yes.
And how much you'll get by calorie restriction plus time restriction at the right time.
Yeah.
So this is a very comprehensive systematic study which essentially showed that if you take mice, reduce their calories by 30%, and give that food in tiny bits of pellets in 9 equal meals distributed throughout 24 hours, then mice will live 10% longer. So that's the contribution of calorie restriction, 10% extra lifespan.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, if you give the same reduced calorie with 8 meals within 12 hours period, then the mice will get another 10% lifespan extension.
Yeah.
But if you give that food within 12 hours at nighttime, when mice are expected to eat, then you increase lifespan by 35%.
Yeah.
So the contribution of timing
Yeah.
is 28%. The
Yeah.
contribution of calorie restriction alone is 10%.
Yeah.
So that's why if you combine these two, then you get the maximum lifespan extension.
Yeah.
So which leads to the point that time restriction, eating your meal within a consistent time window,
Yeah.
when you are awake, of course, will lead to a benefit. But just using the term intermittent fasting does not convey that that scientific insight to the
Yes.
public.
Yeah.
So
I agree.
yeah. So I guess this paper was
And by the way, I've done this by accident, daily time restricted eating
yeah
for like 35 years.
yeah
I don't eat breakfast, and there's question of how important is breakfast. I've always thought of this though in evolutionary terms, that most animals in the wild, they don't wake up and have food waiting for them. They have to, get out, and if they're predators, hunt, and so on. So, I think from an evolutionary perspective, breakfast is the least likely meal.
yeah. So actually, there are beautiful studies done on human hunger. Because if you are completely isolated from outside world and there is no time concept of time, they called so the circadian researchers that do these experiments and ask people, how hungry do you feel? And they have no concept what time it is outside or inside. So the only timing concept comes from the internal circadian clock. Then people actually say they're most hungry in late afternoon, early evening. So our circadian clock actually makes us more hungry towards late afternoon. And that makes sense because that's when we are supposed to eat a big meal so that we can go through the
Yes.
nightly fasting.
Yes.
And another piece of result that came several years ago in mice was in mouse also there is a phenomenon called food anticipatory activity. So
Yeah.
this is something that the maybe the calorie restriction studies might have observed, but they never reported that extensively. That is, if you give mice a reduced amount of calorie in the morning, daytime, mice are supposed to sleep during daytime. What they do is they wake up 2 to 3 hours before the anticipated meal time and they look for food.
Yeah.
That's called food anticipatory activity. And
that's retained with our every other day fasting thing on the on the day the day we're going to give them food after they fasted for 24 hours. They become very active beginning a couple hours before the timing that they know. Essentially their internal clock knows when they're going to get food.
But what is interesting is that particular activity seems to come from ketone bodies production. And
oh, really?
Circadian mutant, so the mice that have a circadian rhythm defect in their liver, they cannot produce enough ketone bodies. So those mice don't have a food anticipatory activity.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And it makes sense because the ketone bodies actually make the brain, it's not food anticipation. In the wild, it is opportunistic food seeking behavior.
Yeah.
Because the mice have to be opportunistic. When you are hungry, you cannot go and hide and be lethargic.
No.
That's the end of your life.
Yes.
In fact, when you're hungry, your brain should work faster to be more opportunistic. Your brain should be more sharp.
Yes.
To find the animal and instead of chasing, to really hunt in a better way. So a mind becomes more creative to seek food, hunt animals and eat. And that happens only in a fasted state. So that's why if we combine these two, then that makes sense that we are designed to eat more food in the late afternoon and we are also designed to have a little bit of ketone body in the morning for that creative
Yeah, so
thought.
that explains why in the morning my mind seems to be working the best, when I
Yeah.
don't eat breakfast, and maybe it's my evolutionary pressure for me to be productive so that my wife and kids don't starve.
Yes, exactly.
But the ketones, I didn't know that finding with the ketones, but there's a lot of evidence ketones are really good, not only energy source for neurons, but they activate signaling pathways
Yeah.
that help the nerve cells function better.
But at the same time, there is another piece that is that we didn't touch on, because if we think about three foundations of health, it's sleep, food, and exercise.
Yeah.
And what is interesting is circadian clock also primes us for better physical activity in late afternoon, early evening,
Yeah.
because our muscles, our body has warmed up, so we don't need that warm up before exercise. And then our muscle tendons also more flexible, so we are least likely to get injured. And the third, that is more important for older people and people who have glucose regulation problem, is muscles actually can absorb sponge, like act as sponge to absorb a lot of glucose even without any help from insulin. So this is the insulin independent glucose absorption by muscle, and this happens when the muscles are more active. So that's why late afternoon physical activity is not only good because you have least risk for injury, you're also more likely to absorb glucose and reduce postprandial hyperglycemia in late evening.
Oh.
And this jives with the circadian clock in the pancreas, because the circadian clock in the pancreas makes the pancreas likely to produce more digestive juice, insulin, and all that stuff in the first half of the day. And in the second half of the day, insulin production slowly goes down. So having more physical activity in late afternoon, early evening is an inbuilt compensatory mechanism to blunt the impact of low insulin in late afternoon.
Let's talk about humans. So your work really, when your work came out with the mouse studies, and then more recently with your human studies, everything shifted, I think, in like human studies with
Yeah.
intermittent fasting. Before there's things that we're involved with, like 5-2 or
Yeah.
and it's both for scientific reason, which you've highlighted, but also for a practical reason and circadian based lifestyle reason, that it's much easier for people. And I should point this out, it takes a while for a person to adapt to daily time restricted eating. It takes several weeks to a month, but once they're adapted, it's easy to do. It can be just part of the daily routine. So I think that's the way to go. And if you go start looking at clinical studies of now, there's like 150
Yeah.
human clinical trials. They're shifting towards daily time restricted eating, again, for two reasons: your work, and I think just the kind of practical aspect.
Yeah, so we have to think about the pragmatic approach to lifestyle intervention. So even the definition of lifestyle is what, when, and how much we eat, sleep, and exercise every day. It's not an intervention, it's something that we do every day.
Yes.
And what and how much we eat is still important, because you cannot just do time restricted eating with nachos and ice cream and expect to live longer.
No.
I must emphasize that we have to pay attention to improved nutrition and reduced calorie to some extent.
Yeah, time restricted eating with sleep deprivation and
no exercise may not help. But what we are finding is very interesting. in human trials, and this is something, this field is very new. Only in the last 5 years, human studies have begun to come out, and it'll see many rounds of revision, refinement, and then identifying barriers to practice, and then figuring out how to overcome those barriers, developing toolbox, how to help people to do time-restricted eating. All of these things will come up.
And
But
educating physicians and other healthcare
educating
workers.
physicians, yeah. But what is interesting, what we're finding is there seems to be a positive feedback loop that helps people to stick to time restricted eating. And let's be very clear about the definition or time restricted eating. People usually think that it's 8 hours of eating, 16 hours of fast. But actually, in mouse studies and also in human studies, we're finding 8, 9, 10 hours of similar, not identical, similar benefits. So that means one can still do 10 hours time restricted eating and see some many.
I've been doing 6 hours for
Yeah.
years. Should I switch or change? No, I
No,
think
you can stay on that. I mean, your body is already adapted to that. So
yeah,
it's
that's right.
so what I'm saying is most people who work for 8 hours, they find it difficult to do 8 hours time restricted eating, but they can do 10 hours. And so what we're finding is once they start sticking to a consistent time window, and again, our advice is very simple and straightforward. That is, after waking up, wait for at least 1 to 2 hours before any calorie, because that's when your night hormones are going down, day hormones are coming to stabilize, and your body is not ready to digest food properly because cortisol is rising fast, melatonin is still high, and both of them will affect glucose homeostasis. So it's better to wait. And
So
then,
that's important because most people eat soon, probably pretty soon after getting up.
yeah, and which is actually not the ideal because your
Yeah.
body's clock is not ready, has not prepared your digestive system and all these other organs to digest and properly assimilate nutrition. So after those 1 or 2 hours, have your breakfast at consistent time. Whatever you are eating, whether you are breaking your fast, that's breakfast. It's not the morning meal. so,
Yeah.
so that breakfast is a strong signal to rest of your body's circadian rhythm. So you have to keep that signal consistent every day. And then after that breakfast time, you count whether if you're Mark Madsen, then eat within 6 hours. And then if you're normal mortal people like me, then you can go up to 10 hours.
Oh, wait a minute. You're saying I'm abnormal?
No, superhuman. You are superhuman.
Oh, okay.
If you're normal human like me, then maybe 8 to 10 hours. And then make sure that your last meal is 2 to 3 hours before bedtime, because that's when your stomach is still digesting food, your blood circulation is mostly rushing towards the core of the body to digest and assimilate nutrition. So that's the 8 to 10 hours time restricted. What we're finding is people, when they do this, then a lot of people who have indigestion or acid reflux, those indigestion and acid reflux goes down. So they feel actually their gut function improves. The second thing is we don't know why, but it also improves people's sleep quality. It doesn't extend sleep duration, but sleep quality improves. And what we think is the arousal threshold goes up. So that means small disturbances don't wake them up. And also people who have this problem of waking up around 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and staying awake for half an hour, tossing and turning on the bed, that disappears in many, not all people. And we
So
don't know.
by quality of sleep, you mean more slow wave sleep?
We haven't actually looked at
Ah,
polysomnography data. It's just subjective satisfaction with sleep and subjective.
oh, I see. Okay. Uh-huh.
So that improves. And if you sleep better and if your digestion is better at night, of course, you feel more energetic in the morning. So these people say they're more energetic in the morning and they're more active a lot in the morning. Now, after they adopt to timeless eating for few weeks, if they eat late into the night, then they realize that the food doesn't get digested properly. In the morning, they have a hangover, food hangover. So they call it the food hangover. So as if the stomach was sleeping and did not digest food, and they
Yeah.
feel crappy. And another thing that we find in older individuals is that joint pain goes down, because we think in mouse studies we have seen that inflammation, chronic inflammation goes down. So that might be helping some of the older individuals who have joint pain. And when your joint pain goes down and you're feeling more energetic,
Yes.
in some people it increases their physical activity, not all. In some people it increases physical activity. So we think there is this positive feedback loop that helps people to stay on this program,
Yeah.
because when they get off the program, the body reminds them how crappy it is to have that food hangover and not sleep well and get acid reflux. So I think there are two sides of the coin, that if you get off, then the clock pushes you back on.
Yeah. That, for a lot of people, I know it's proven pretty easy for them to skip breakfast. And then, because from a social standpoint, right, lunch and dinner are the most likely meals you're going to be eating with, whatever, people at work or family. And, so in your book, The Circadian Code, you go into a lot of detail on the things you've been talking about, obviously. In my book, I have one little section on historical perspective, and there's a guy named Edward Dewey, who in 1900
Mhm.
published it was actually a small book called The No Breakfast Plan. And this was based pretty much on his own personal experience with skipping breakfast and how he felt and his health and so forth. And then also Upton Sinclair wrote a book, The Fasting Cure, back then. And then there's this, so there was a lot of interest, there's no science, but there was a lot of interest by certain people in fasting for health. And then there's this period of 50, 60 years or more where it kind of faded out. You don't see, even publications like I mentioned, these books. And then the science started up.
Yeah.
And that's really the science. The point is the science has really propelled the current interest in this because it's demonstrated directly, multiple health benefits and
Yeah.
all the things you've been talking about.
But I think we have to literally think of what is breakfast. It's breaking the fast. If you haven't fasted,
Right.
then that morning meal becomes toxic. You have to fast
Right.
enough.
But if you don't eat breakfast, then breaking the fast is lunch.
Yeah. So your lunch becomes your breakfast because you're
Right.
breaking the fast.
Exactly.
So historically, if you go back to even before early modern era, so that's before 16th century.
Yes.
Before 16th century, there was no concept of morning meal. And people were eating mostly, like you said, the hunter-gatherers or farmers, they started eating several hours after waking up.
Yeah.
And breakfast is linked to coffee consumption, because in Istanbul and Turkey and all those areas where coffee started in the 16th century, coffee was an evening drink, and then coffee became a morning drink because in Islam you have to do the morning prayer, and people who had difficulty staying awake in the morning, they would get up, have a cup of coffee, stay awake to do the morning prayer. But then what they realized was, after several weeks, months, or years of drinking coffee with empty stomach, they would have acid reflux. So then they
Yeah.
had this idea that you should have some food before coffee.
Huh.
So in Turkish, the word breakfast literally means food before coffee. And that's how the morning eating
Interesting.
rituals came.
Interesting.
Yeah, so
Huh.
these days when people say, okay, I'll skip breakfast, I can have just little black coffee, I just tell them, okay, so you can have that, but pay attention to your acid reflux or esophageal reflux. If you have that problem, then you may
Yeah.
have to change that habit.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I used to drink green tea every morning, but I've quit doing that recently, and
Hmm.
um, I don't miss it anymore.
It's kind of amazing that our body is very adaptable. It will adapt to everything.
Yeah, it sure is. Yeah.
It can get addicted to food starting from morning till you go to bed, and people think that they cannot stop that addiction. And then once you get used to sticking to time restricted eating a certain window, then the body also gets used to it. So we have to understand the awesome power of our body to get used to new habit. So we should not feel scared that, hey, if I cannot do this because I love my nightcap, or I love my morning biscuit or crackers with coffee, and I cannot stop that. No, you can't. It just takes a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks, to adopt a new habit, and then your body gets used to it.
We did some studies where we recorded electrical activity in the brain and animals on, this was on our every other day
Yeah.
testing in it. Beginning about after 2 weeks, we see a shift from, well, essentially we see enhanced GABA
Hmm.
tone. GABA is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter.
Yeah.
And we noticed that once the animals were adapted to intermittent fasting for several weeks, their levels of anxiety seemed to be reduced.
Yeah.
So that's consistent with that. So the point is there's changes going on in the neural network activity in the brain that take several weeks
Yeah.
to happen, and those are probably contributing to the adaptation so that you're no longer hungry,
Yeah.
you're able to focus, because a lot of people, they eat breakfast and they don't eat breakfast one day and they feel irritable.
Yeah.
But all of those things are adapted to so that they no longer
Yeah.
are bothersome. So Satchin, we've spent,
Almost 1.5 hours, 90 minutes.
yeah, an hour and a half, and I've enjoyed it. And you've done a really, it's a great sequence, I think, in talking about your background and going from plants to animals to melanopsin, and then the circadian rhythms of individual cells, and then to your discoveries concerning how food timing affects health in a dramatic way, and then on to human studies, and now there's a lot of clinical trials underway and in the works with daily time restricted eating, and I think it's really promising. It's as promising as exercise in a way. Um, Everybody knows exercise is good for health, and I think the daily time restricted eating is obviously good and a nice complement to exercise, proper sleep, and also during the day engaging in intellectual activities
Yeah.
like we've been doing now. That's definitely good for your brain.
Yeah.
You got to keep exercising your brain cells during the day, and then let them
Yeah.
relax and grow, form new connections during the nighttime.
Thank you, Mark. Your research has also contributed immensely to what we do, because the fundamental response to fasting or staying in a negative energy balance, and how the body and brain adapts to it, that's also part of the circadian mechanism. So
Yeah,
what we are seeing is the confluence of different fields merging together
absolutely.
to let us understand how to live a long and meaningful life, because it's not only living a long life or healthy life, our brain also has to stay healthy and happy and feel the sense of fulfillment. Like you said, we have to engage in intellectual productive activity, brain activity during daytime. So that's the goal, to live a
Yeah.
long, meaningful, healthy life.
Yeah.
And thank you for doing this.
And it's, for people watching, I mean, this is an example, and there aren't all that many, it's not that common where, so in both our careers, our basic research,
Yeah.
which initially didn't have any obvious implications for human health, and certainly not to the extent that we found with intermittent fasting. It's even within, our career. And of course,
Yeah.
you're considerably younger than me, so you've got a lot more ahead of you. But we've seen, the basic research lead to further animal studies, refinement, human studies, and even application that a lot of people now are doing intermittent fasting and finding it's really helpful for their health and cognition.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot of fun.
Okay.
Science is fun.
Yes. Thank you, Matt.
Okay,
Thank you,
Satchin.
Mark, and have a wonderful day. And
Okay, I hope you have a good rest of the summer.
yeah, we'll
Okay,
talk soon. Bye-bye.
bye.